Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here, and those of you online. It's been a while. This conversation has been a long time coming. I'm pleased that we had the chance to have it. Many of you, thank you for responding to my invitation to be here. Regardless of where you stand and whether you have connection, the direct connection to the region or not, or where you stand in the issues. I think these are important conversations for us to have as members of the Pardee community and as students of international affairs, as I said in my note. And I think as students of international affairs, we care about peace and the protection of human life. And from that standpoint, again, regardless of where you are on the finer points, this situation in the Middle East is agonizing and intolerable, really. So today we launched a series of conversations about the region and about the conflict between Israel and Palestine, some aspects of history, its origins, and perspectives of experts in the field. And this will be a series of 4 initial conversations. You've seen the schedule. This first one with privilege to have Professor Ian Lustick from the University of Pennsylvania with us. The subsequent ones will be either hybrid or with our speakers in person. So stand by for more information on that. The important thing is I don't think any of us have any illusions about solving this long-standing conflict or its current iteration through these conversations, but our aim is understanding, is knowledge, and quite frankly, for me as dean, responding to the needs of our community, students, faculty, and staff alike. All of us are pain in violence. So, there was a piece in the New York Times last weekend, Michelle Goldberg's column, where she quoted Kenneth Stern at Bard, who's this director of the Center on the Study of Hate, who said the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should make it an ideal subject to teach critical thinking and how to have difficult discussions. But unfortunately, he added, instead, it is being used as a toxin that threatens the entire academic exercise. We are here to counter the latter part of that statement. We are trying to learn from each other and from informed experts like Professor Lustick. And I will express my thanks to you for approaching this in that spirit, and especially to my colleagues who organized this series of sessions. 2 of them are up here, Jeremy Menchik and Nora Laurie, who were instrumental in getting us here today. But also Professor Shilda, Professor Mako, Professor Litvin, Professor Berger, who were all involved in trying to facilitate these conversations. So thank you, colleagues, for your aggressiveness in pushing this forward, and because it meets a real need. And I think a lacuna in our campus discussion and our ability to learn together and to persevere as a community of students and faculty and staff, a community of learners, regardless of our backgrounds or perspectives or our orientations. So I want to thank Professor Lustick for coming and joining us this afternoon. And I want to thank all of you for being here. The only ground rules are a civil and respectful discussion. And I look forward to this and to our subsequent meetings together. Thank you.
All right.
Why don't I start by thanking Dean Taylor for making this possible. As well as Elizabeth Omrine, who makes everything possible logistically, intellectually. She really is the one who is the nuts and bolts. But when I say I'm thanking Dean Taylor, I'm really quite serious about that. He's putting his neck out and he's being brave. And his instincts are that to face hard issues, we do it together. We do it as a community, and we do it face to face. We do it to listen listening to each other. We don't do it by hiding away. And that's the place of the university. And that's a hard thing for him to do. And so I really am extremely grateful to him for sticking his neck out like that. And for all of you for being part of the community that we're pulling into being. And I'm going to start, however, by thanking Professor Lustick, Ian Lustick, for being with us. I'm going to do a very brief intro of him and Professor Laurie, and then I'm going to be just moderating from here on out. So introducing Ian is a difficult task, and the best way to explain it is hopefully by accessing something in you, in my students. I hope some of you students have favorite professors from undergrad, from grad school, from high school, those people who mentored you and taught you how to take principled stances on hard issues, those professors who helped you argue and debate and reason through issues. And for many of us in this room, even though I've actually met Professor Lustick before, I'm sorry he's not here, Professor Lustick is that person for a lot of us. He's a professor's professor. He is somebody who throughout his career has stuck his neck out to take risks, make principled stances, make principled commitments, and he has not been afraid to say things that are unpopular, but important to say. I'm just going to give you a couple examples. So back in the 1970s, he was one of the first scholars of the Middle East to talk about a two-state solution, back when it was unpopular to talk about a two-state solution. Now, 4 decades later, he's talking about a one-state solution, and he's been really responsible for talking about the one-state reality and the ways in which the two-state solution is maybe no longer on the table in the same way that it once was. And so he's been really brave in both of those moments. He's also one of the founders of Israel Studies in the United States, a critical nest of scholarship that's helped to really bring a lot of scholarly expertise to the study of the region. Likewise, he's one of the first political scientists, and this is where I first encountered him in the scholarship on how history matters, how history shapes contemporary politics and institutions. It's a very familiar refrain in the Pardee school. We kind of take it for granted that history matters, like we indoctrinate you into that, but we do that because he taught us. That's really where that comes from. Likewise, in the 1990s, the social sciences was really moving towards a vein of scholarship called rational choice theory. And he was really early and loud and clairvoyant in talking about the ideological elements of that particular project. And now that's common sense and we all understand it. But again, he was early and he was clairvoyant. So that's why he's the perfect person to start this series, because he's brave and he's principled and he's scholarly. And he's exactly the voice that we all need during this moment of crisis, and he has been for many decades. So I'm incredibly glad to have him here. Also 20 books. Yeah, I guess I'm focusing more on the personal than the scholarly. Nora, likewise, is I think a younger version, but his equivalent here at BU. Many of you have had her in class. She's principled, scholarly, a real mentor, both to her students and to her colleagues, award-winning teacher, award-winning researcher, and she's also on leave right now, so she shouldn't even be here. So we're all the more grateful to have her back at Pardee to lead this conversation. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Professor Laurie and Russ.
Yeah, it's good to be, thank you, Professor Lustick, for joining us. I've been a consumer of your work for many years, and I'm really happy to be on campus right now. I think that, so I'm currently a Goldman faculty fellow at Brandeis University, but I'm using this year for research. So I've spent most of the past couple months in the Middle East and kind of going back and forth. So this is a very small window that I'm actually in the States. I was in Doha a couple of weeks ago, very different environment. I'm heading to the UAE and Saudi in a couple of days. So it's been really interesting to also be at Brandeis. And just, it really has punctuated how much pain there is collectively across our communities right now. And I'm gonna definitely 90% chance of crying during this session. And that's part of my intro, is that when we say respectful, civil dialogue, I'm not saying be dispassionate. Like, I can't model that for you. I'm not gonna say like silence yourself and self-censor, but I am gonna challenge you to do two things that are really hard to do when we're dealing with this kind of violence and the agony that we see its ripple effects everywhere, right? The first is to think beyond the paradigm of good and evil. And I know that you might, concede like, like very, very bad doesn't get to something like evil does. And there are certain things that we have to just call evil. If you can't conceive of a paradigm beyond good and evil, can you separate evil actions from evil individuals? Or do you really think there's evil embodied in individuals? And if you do, then have you left space for social science to explain anything? Because the outcomes are already predetermined. I'm not saying that from a perspective of like atheism, of like, we need to look at what's happening in this world and like the divine doesn't matter. But I think even from a position of faith, all of the traditions teach you that the ultimate arbiter of good and evil comes from the divine, right? It's not among us. And so it's really hard. And I'm going to try really hard to not use that language. And I want to challenge you in this conversation and throughout the others, can you do that? And if you can't, just pay attention to how much space are you allowing for other explanations, or is this the explanatory variable that is powering all of the outcomes for you? The second thing I'm going to say is, what can we do with pain that is not rage? How do we, rage can be productive. Rage can lead to courage and change. Like, it can be productive, but what can we do with pain that doesn't lead to the explosion of rage towards whoever's closest to you that is not aligned with the way you're seeing things? And that's my main hope for this campus, is we're not going to necessarily solve, we're not going to solve things over there, right? And it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do from this space, but like, are the battles that you're fighting on campus the most important battles? Can you think about where to direct your rage? And it might come towards me at this stage. It might come towards Professor Lustick. I'm not going to pretend like everyone is going to, you might be mad about what we say. You might be mad about what we don't say. You might be mad about like how much we give details and show our pain about certain deaths versus others. I can't pretend to be like this completely, disembodied person. And I think the difference is, not teaching Middle East politics this semester initially was kind of a relief, because I just don't know how to explain what's happening, frankly. But I think when I am teaching, I pull myself together and I perform for you. And when I'm not, I've just been in an abyss of mourning. I'm wearing black for a reason. And so in these moments, like when you have rage towards me or any of us, like other students, staff, faculty, speakers, can you take, turn it back into pain, give it to me, I'll take it. Can we think about collectivizing our grief and not lashing out? So that's what I mean about civil, respectful dialogue. I'm not saying this is enforced silence, don't say what you feel. I'm just saying, like, can we think beyond good and evil? And can we, leave space for explanations? And Professor Lustick is the right person to guide us through this path because of his, development of a really important field within political science of historical institutionalism, which is understanding patterns over time and how they change outcomes over time. And he also has written about vengeance and what that does to policy outcomes. So those will be some of the themes. We also want to leave space for you. When I was saying like I'm in an abyss of mourning, like I think that when I'm teaching, I also check in with my students. I say like, what are you doing to be proactive about your mental health this semester? How are you taking care of yourself? And I think when I'm not doing it for you, I'm not doing it for myself. And so I would like, for people in the room who want to stay after, Professor Menchik is also going to be here. I know some other faculty members, Professor Mako, et cetera, will stay. We want to hear what's happening. We want to hear how we can support you, how you're treating each other. And so we will give some time for that. And I'm not saying none of that can come up, but let's see if we can get into explanation without justification. Let's see if we can start to think about what social science can give us, even in moments where we have just profound pain about what's going on. All right, so Professor Lustick, that was a long intro before we finally let you, intervene here. And I guess, should we start? Let's start with October. What has happened over the past month in terms of just deaths? I'm not going to talk about injuries, but death count and kind of, I won't get into all the gruesome details, but Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th has yielded 1,400 deaths. 240 hostages are still not home. People of all ages, children, babies, old people, brutalized, villages ablaze, attacked a music festival, rape, and this triggered not just really vivid understandings of like what happened during the Holocaust, but millennia of pogroms against Jews that has really heightened feelings of being under threat. And anti-Semitism is rising. And I'm not saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, I'm saying also anti-Semitism is rising. On the Israeli response on Gaza, not counting occupied territories, we're looking at, as of November, so this was yesterday at 5 p.m. by CNN, based on figures that were both, that these were from Palestinian Ministry of Health in Ramallah. 10,515 confirmed deaths, 4,000 approximately are children. An additional 1,300 or 270 have been reported missing, are currently under rubble. We know that there's no water, there's no electricity, there's no food, there's no exit, there is no safe refuge and no safe exit. And without fuel, we're probably undercounting the bodies, because right now recovering is being done manually by hand. So there are lots of, hospitals have been targeted, schools have been targeted. There's a mounting civilian death amount, and it's really hard to think about the deaths on all sides. And I know that sounds like I'm saying all sides, but these are civilian deaths and we have to mourn them collectively. And if you can't mourn them collectively, what's happening? Think about that. Think about whether evil is you're thinking about evil more than thinking about what's on earth, right? How did we get here? So I think my first question to you is, in the debates, when we've heard things said, it's often like October 7th. So there's this punctuated moment in time, a day, and then the response is, yeah, but you have to go back 75 years. And so it's a really long durée. And that's hard to really get our heads around. So I wonder, as someone who's written 20 books on the subject and has been thinking about the historical trajectory of this conflict, what are some of the key critical junctures or moments in time that you think we should be paying attention to? It might be starting in 48, but what in addition to, what would you?
Well, thanks, Nora, and I do appreciate and understand the prologue here, but I also want to model in the way I answer these questions how to do it in a way that is focused on trying to learn, trying to reduce the amount of confusion and ignorance. And one of the things that for me I've learned is just how much ignorance there is, and we can address it in a very important way right now. When you ask for a critical juncture, there's no more important critical juncture than 48. But actually, it's not 48, it's 49. So what happened in 48 was that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, about 750,000 altogether, were displaced, which happens in war all the time. there are over 240,000 Israelis already who have been displaced from their homes around the Gaza Strip and south of Lebanon. That's what happens in war. People get displaced. What turns displaced persons into refugees is not that they leave their homes in time of war because of fear or expulsion or violence or destruction. That's not what causes them to be refugees. What produces refugees out of displaced persons is not allowing them to return to their homes after the fighting stops. And that was the first critical juncture, was the decision by the Israeli government in 1949 not to allow any Palestinians back to their homes of the 750,000. Now, there were about 15,000 that were ultimately allowed to under a special program, and a couple, and others, about 20,000, infiltrated back, but most of the infiltrators were either killed or re-expelled. But what people have to understand is that those 240,000 Israelis who've been displaced, they would become refugees if somebody told them they could no longer return to their homes. So the reason that Gaza is filled with refugees today is because during the fighting, both the civil war, before the Arab states invaded in May 1948, there was a civil war in Palestine over whether there would be partition of the country, and if so, what the borders would be of the Jewish and the Arab states. And the Zionist forces, the Jewish forces, there was no Israel yet. That didn't come into existence until May 1948, so you can't say the Israeli forces. They implemented something called a plan that they had, Plan Dalet, Plan D, which was to go outside the boundaries that the UN had stipulated for the Jewish state and take territory to expand the amount of land. And a lot of that territory was in the middle of the country and in the south, between Tel Aviv and Gaza. And there was an attack by the Irgun on Jaffa, which pushed the people in Jaffa out. So the people in the southwestern part of Palestine were moved to the pocket of Gaza, which was where the Egyptian army was able to hold out eventually, and where the Palestinian forces were able to hold out. So you ended up with 200,000 displaced persons in Gaza, in addition to the 100,000 or so people who lived there to begin with. They became refugees because they weren't allowed to return to their villages. Interestingly, their villages, many dozens of them, were located in the area around Gaza that the attackers from Gaza entered. So it's possible that some of those killers who came from Gaza and entered the Israeli settlements are actually the grandchildren of refugees who came from that area where those villages no longer exist, or only the ruins of them. But so that is critical juncture number one. That people ignore it because they spend so much time deciding which refugees were expelled and which refugees were fled, but they were just displaced persons, and that happens all the time. What caused the refugee problem was the refusal to let them return. And that was because Israel did not want lots of Arabs in the country. Now, one of Israel's great leaders, Chaim Weizmann, when he saw how many Arabs had fled, said, "What a miraculous simplification of our task." There's a famous quote. So they were taking advantage of that situation. But as some members of the Israeli cabinet at that time said, we will be building time bombs of hatred for generations in the Arab world if we don't allow the refugees back, if we don't solve this problem. And he, the man who made that comment, obviously was correct. Now, if we go forward in time, I don't want to go through the whole 75-year history, but there's groups of incidents that you can say were critical junctures, in the sense that after the 1967 war, that is, after Israel took control of Gaza and the West Bank, there are ways that Israel could have left and created, and a Palestinian state could have emerged, in which Gaza Palestinians and West Bank Palestinians, as much as they might have liked many of them to return inside of Israel, they would have had access to visit because there would be peace between the two states. And it is true that Israel actually occupied Gaza in 1956. It occupied Gaza when it entered Egypt in 1956 in the Suez War. It actually conquered both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. Under strong American and Soviet pressure in 1957, Israel withdrew from the Sinai and from Gaza. So Israel can withdraw. And of course, Israel withdrew again its military forces and its settlements in 2005. But one of the interesting things about Israeli withdrawals is that every time the Israeli army leaves a territory without an agreement with the people who live in the territory, the army always returns, whether it's Lebanon, it's Jenin, it's Sinai, or it's Gaza. If there is an agreement, as there is with Egypt, Israel has not returned to the Sinai. It has not reinvaded Sinai. But that's another key juncture when Sharon took Israel's forces out of Gaza, but did not want to negotiate with any Palestinians, not the PLO and not with Hamas, over what would become of Gaza. And that put that action into this category where Israel will always ultimately return because the security situation will break down. Actually, Sharon wanted chaos there because it would be an excuse that he wanted not to have to negotiate the future of the West Bank, which he really did not want to withdraw Israeli settlements or military from. Just one more note is that I could go through many dates. The Hashemite Kingdom Plan, when Jordan in 1972 offered to take responsibility for the West Bank and for Gaza in one big Hashemite kingdom. The mid-1970s, when the PLO offered to start negotiations about a national authority of some kind, which is what the PNA ultimately got called under Oslo. And Israel chose to support the Muslim Brotherhood, not the PLO, because the Muslim Brotherhood had thought as a religious organization was less promising as an enemy, less potent as an enemy than the PLO. That was a big mistake. And we could have been in a very different place. In 1993, the Israeli government decided after the first Intifada, it did not want to talk to the Intifada leadership, that thousands of local Palestinians who really represented the people of Gaza and the West Bank, they were kept in jail. And instead, Arafat and his close associates were brought from Tunis to try to run a patronage system in the West Bank and Gaza that did not have any very much political legitimacy, because Israel didn't give enough power or land to have political legitimacy. And so another opportunity was lost that could have regularized the situation in Gaza. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I guess I have to say one more. In 2006, the only free election ever held in Gaza was held. And to the astonishment of George W. Bush, who was pushing for these free elections and democratization, and to the astonishment of the Israelis and I think perhaps the PA, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas won. Hamas won the only free election ever held in Gaza. Nobody disputes that they won it. They won it. They had a reputation for honesty and non-corruption and so on. Well, the United States, Israel, and the PA did not accept that victory, and they launched a coup attempt against Hamas in 2006. That's usually not mentioned when it is mentioned that Hamas seized military control of the Strip in 2007. Actually, what they did is they defeated the coup attempt. So they emerged as the single dominant power in Gaza. And that's when Israel essentially created Gaza as what I call a prison. That is, they wanted to hermetically, as much as possible, hermetically seal the Gaza Strip within Israel, keep it within Israel, but not allow free movement across it. That action, that closed the possibility that was real, that Hamas would evolve in a different way, and instead of becoming a kind of super violent organization commandeered by its military wing, it would be a political opposition, a kind of loyal opposition within a Palestinian state, not accepting the legitimacy of Israel any more than the Begin party in Israel ever accepted the legitimacy of Arab rule of any part of the land of Israel, but still being a part of the system. That possible future was closed off. And instead, Israel adopted a policy of what's known as lasachet et hadeshen, to mow the lawn. In other words, Israel gave up the idea that they could ever change the hostility of Gazan Palestinians and of Hamas toward Israel. So instead of trying to deter Hamas, the idea was every 3 years, Israel would go in and mow the lawn, would destroy the infrastructure, destroy the capability of Hamas to attack for another few years. And then you look forward to another mowing of the lawn again. There have been about 4 or 5 of these wars in Gaza, these lawn mowing expeditions, and that set up the opportunity and the incentive for rage in Gaza to finally explode. And so those were critical choices, not to allow Gaza to move in a direction, or Palestine to move in a direction that might have prevented this kind of explosion.
Thank you. That was actually really helpful. So can I, Professor Menchik mentioned this when he was introducing you, but in the 70s, what was the two-state solution? Like, what is this? We hear it a lot. What does it actually mean or entail? And how has your thinking, transitioned from that time to now?
Yeah, sure. So the two-state solution is simply partition. When the British ruled Palestine, they made a mess of it, and they couldn't figure out what to do. Finally, in 1936, one of their many commissions said, it's an irrepressible conflict. We have to divide the country. We'll make one part of it Jewish and another part of it Arab. This was a two-state solution. It was not implemented, but it did plant the seed of something very important, because one of the elements in the Peel Commission was there were so many more Arabs in what was supposed to be the Jewish state and no Jews in the Arab state, that the Peel Commission said, of course, some hundreds of thousands of Arabs will have to be transferred from the Jewish state to the Arab state. Well, when Ben-Gurion heard this in 1937, he was astonished, because he had always thought that it would be great to transfer the Arabs out of a Jewish state, but he never thought the international community would tolerate it. And here was the Peel Commission saying, yeah, that will be part of the proposal if we implement it. So in 1948, that was still in Ben-Gurion's mind, that the international community actually would not stop the expulsion of large numbers of Palestinians. That's just kind of a footnote, a very interesting one. So the two-state solution idea started then, as opposed to one country, a binational country where Arabs and Jews would each have a certain proportion of the power by law, or a country where everyone is the equal citizen and people would vote and decide who they wanted. Instead, you'd have two separate states and maybe a shared Jerusalem or a separate Jerusalem. Now, when the UN adopted this idea in 1947, it was the majority report in the UN Special Commission on Palestine investigation of what to do about the problem, because the British said, we don't want it anymore, we're giving it to the UN. The UN studied it, and there were 2 reports, one to make it a binational state, and one to divide it into very strangely shaped Arab and Jewish states. With a lot of pressure from both the Soviet Union and the United States on countries like Guatemala and others that didn't really know what to do, the General Assembly, by a bare margin, approved the majority report, which was partition. But they didn't approve any way to implement it. And the British were only interested in getting British troops out of Palestine safely. And they actually contributed to the chaos by leaving cities suddenly and letting the Jews and Arabs fight over who would control the police station. So civil war broke out, and there was no UN force, no UN money to set up the 2 states. In that context, Israel, or the Jewish forces, expanded and delimited the border that they have, defeated Arab armies that attacked, and the Palestinian state the territories were either absorbed by Israel, or they were taken over by Jordan, by the Jordanian Legion, or by Egypt in Gaza. For 1948 to 1967, the only people who talked about a 2-state solution were the communists. The Communist Party has always talked about the importance of recognizing 2 nations in Palestine, well, at least ever since 48. But it didn't matter until 1967, because in 1967, you had Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who were saying, well, we didn't like King Hussein of Jordan at all, and we didn't like Egypt. Maybe now we could get something livable, a deal with the Israelis. We'll have a demilitarized or weak Palestinian state. So that raised, and that was not yet the PLO saying that. Those were notables within the West Bank and Gaza. And when I was a student, when I was the age of many of the students in this room, I spent 6 months in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and I wrote my first published article on what do West Bank Arabs really want. And I went around interviewing journalists and mayors in Gaza and in the West Bank. And what they told me, between me and you and the lamppost, is we want a separate state. But the PLO won't say that yet. And that's what I wrote in my article, which you can read in Jewish Frontier, June 1970, if you want to know how a young student can actually get deep into a problem. There were people in the Israeli government that thought this is in fact, a whole plan was developed within the cabinet that I write about in my book to create a Palestinian state right away as a comprehensive solution. But it was nixed by the cabinet. And the reason that all of the proposals were nixed, including proposals by Arab notables in the West Bank and Gaza, just to be able to speak freely and publicly about their desire for negotiations, those were banned as illegal political activity. All political activity was illegal, not just violence. Why? Because the government knew that there were elements in the government, in the National Religious Party, and even in the Labor Party, that would have brought down the coalition, would have called for new elections if the government had decided it was going to move toward compromise on the West Bank and Gaza, because those were parts of the land of Israel. The government preferred to maintain its coalition rather than risk running a new election on the issue of should we compromise with the Palestinians, which was not a winning issue after the 1967 war. And that failure, that reality, that domestic politics in Israel kept the elites from forbidding Palestinians from coming forward to negotiate, spelled the doom of that two-state solution early on. The PLO eventually adopted it. The United States slowly adopted it. I started a petition campaign among Jews called Yesh Breira. There is an alternative in Berkeley, where I was, but it spread throughout the world to have a two states living in peace together with to end settlements in the occupied territories. And that's when there were only 1,500 settlers beyond the Green Line, beyond Jerusalem. Actually, 1,100. And now there are 750,000 in the West Bank. 1 out of 11 Jewish Israelis lives over the Green Line in the West Bank. So the two-state solution actually was adopted by America, by most politicians in the United States, about 20 years too late, because by that time, Israel had changed from something like the state of Connecticut or, kind of blue state. It was a purple state like Pennsylvania or North Carolina in the 80s, but after the 2000s, after the Second Intifada, it became Oklahoma, Idaho, Nebraska. It's a deeply red state, not ready for any kind of two-state solution.
Fascinating. I have so many follow-up questions, but I do want to get to the what you write about with the one-state reality. So kind of over time, scholars have kind of considered Israel and the occupied territories as a single state comprising 3 spaces under Israeli sovereignty, subject to different systems of rule. So 1948 Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. The Israeli government controls all the external borders and airspace of that combined area and about 90% of its land. Is that accurate? Like, how do we understand, what is this one state reality that, what does that mean? Yeah.
I think the most useful thing I can do right now is explain the difference between talking about a one-state reality and a one-state solution. I am often misrepresented as advocating a one-state solution. I used to have a solution, and that was a two-state solution. Now, what do I mean by that? I used to have one. That means I didn't have just a pretty picture of the future, a future that I thought would satisfy enough of the basic needs on both sides that it was pretty to me. I can actually think of lots of pretty pictures. The thing about the two-state solution is a pretty picture, which is not perfect. They're just, the problems associated with it are a lot better than the problems we have today. That's what But the reason I could call it a solution is I could see the plausible path to get there politically. I could see a Labour Party government that wanted territorial compromise because it didn't want lots of Arabs in the country. I could see a PLO leadership under somebody like Abu Mazen or even Arafat, who preferred to make a go of a smaller state and finesse the refugee question in a variety of ways and go forward from that. And I could see the United States having a president willing to take the domestic political risks in a time of war, or because he was or she was so popular. I could see how that could occur. Maybe it would only have a 30% chance of, but that's plausible at least. It's a politically realistic path. I would call that a solution. Now I don't have a solution. I don't know of a path to anything with much better problems than we have today. I think I know a path to avoid even worse catastrophes than we have today, but that's a different story, and we can talk about it later. How do we avoid a super catastrophe from the catastrophe that we have? That's different from finding a solution, okay? Now, then the question is, so people used to say, you can't have a one-state solution because you cannot have one state. It's impossible. And when I point out that that's not impossible, there is one state already. It's a reality. It's not a solution. It's not pretty. Nobody likes the picture. That's why you can't say it's a solution, but it's a reality. And what do I mean by a state? Political scientists mean something very specific when they talk about a state. A state is the organization that enforces property rights. What does that mean? That means that if you have a house and you want to enjoy that house, that's fine. How do you keep people from taking it away from you? Well, you have a police force that prevents burglars from coming in or deters them from trying. And you pay taxes to the government to make sure that you're protected, that your property is protected if you have the deed. If there is no government, then there are no property rights. And if there are no property rights, there's nobody enforcing them. Let's say you live in the South Bronx and you have a nice laundry, and somebody comes into your laundry and tells you what a nice laundry you have. It's a pity if it would burn down. You say, what are you talking about? Well, I was just thinking, it's a really nice business you have here. For a small fee, I can make sure that this doesn't burn down. In other words, this is the mafia telling the laundry, we are going to burn down your store unless you pay us money every week. Well, that's what a state is. We don't call it a gang, we call it a state, but you pay your taxes to protect your property. Now, the only organization in Palestine, in the whole country, from the river to the sea, that can say whether or not a building that's standing today will be destroyed tomorrow is the state of Israel. Whether you're in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or the Galilee. There's only one organization that can do that. So that means there's one state and it rules or dominates the area. It doesn't mean it closely governs everyone in it. As you pointed out, there are different zones within that state, and that's not unusual at all. Puerto Rico is in the United States, and it's governed in a very different way. The District of Columbia is governed in a different way. Alaska, for that matter, is governed in a different way than New York State. That's not unusual. But you have, as you pointed out, the West Bank, where there's a patchwork of, I would call them the Arab departments, the PAs, or the Arab Department for Judea and Samaria, which is what Israel calls the West Bank. Then you have East Jerusalem, expanded East Jerusalem, in which the 350,000 Palestinians who live there are not citizens of Israel, but they're citizens of the city. The West Bank Palestinians are not citizens of any Israeli city. They cannot vote in anything. But in East Jerusalem, the East Jerusalem Arabs have the right to vote in a Jerusalem election, but they're not, can't vote in Knesset elections. Inside the Green Line, in Israel from 1949, the Palestinians who live there are citizens of the state. In Gaza, they not only are not citizens like the West Bank, but they have no way of traveling outside, and they are essentially in in a prison. Now, this is worth going into now in order to say what I mean by the one-state reality. People can say, "You mean Gaza is inside the state?" And yes, that's right. Israel has not been able to decide whether it wants Gaza to be in the state or outside the state. Golda Meir declared it an inseparable part of Israel in the early 70s and refused to accept the idea that Egypt or Jordan would take responsibility for it, let alone the Palestinians. Israel, as Nora pointed out, controls all of what goes in and out of Gaza, whether it's food, fuel, electricity. That's why the idea of you having a war with another country and suddenly you can actually deprive that country of everything is because that country is actually in your country. You control all the electromagnetic fields, the frequencies. You control whether fishermen can go fishing, and if so, how many kilometers out. You control everything. So that is actually what a country does when it can't figure out if it wants something inside or outside. It makes it a prison. That's what a prison is. Think about the prisons inside of the Green Line, Shikma prison, or Ashkelon, or Megiddo, or any of the Eshel prison, any of those prisons which hold thousands of Palestinian inmates. What goes on in the prison yard and in the cells is not controlled by Israel. It's controlled by the Palestinian prisoner organizations. And yet we don't say that those prisons are not in Israel. Similarly, what the Netanyahu government especially did is treat Hamas as its prisoner organization to manage the affairs of an immiserated Palestinian population, using money that came from Qatar and using advantages that the Israeli government would dribble out to Hamas to decide who or how different people in Gaza would be able to exit the strip to make money and so on. So in that way, if you look at it that way, Israel is a one state in which it has a very large prison within it. And you had a prison revolt because the prisoner organization turned on its wardens, surprised the hell out of them. It was bound to happen because the system that Israel created was one that needed to contain explosive volatility that was constantly building, the rage and discontent and immiseration of an exploding population. Any system that is trying to permanently constrain a system like that, any apparatus will fail eventually, and it won't fail gradually. When you put air in a balloon and expand it, pop, it pops, and it doesn't pop gradually. That is how systems of constrained volatility end. And that's what we saw. And we'll see it again unless that prison is closed somehow, one way or another.
I have so many other questions. I also am wary that there are people in the room and online. So, okay, so very quickly, I will ask, you've mentioned the United States several times, and, 20 years late, I just came back. Bahrain and Doha was interesting because, what people are watching on social media here is what's happening in Gaza is national news every day. So that's why it's interesting to also be at Brandeis, because it's forcing me to actually see both communities at the same time. And it's much easier when you're there and you don't really have to think about other deaths, right? And what's been fascinating is the way political action has taken in Bahrain that we haven't seen before, specifically lots of boycotting of US products. So sometimes they're, US products that are seen as aligned with Israel, or those companies have made statements, for example, McDonald's, Starbucks, empty. But there's a lot of other US products that actually have no stance on this conflict, and people are boycotting it because this is not perceived externally, in my anecdotal sort of reading of that, as being just Israel. This is seen as, this is the United States, and this is a different kind of war. The US is usually has a lot of casualties and says, but we didn't mean to, right? We didn't, the language of this is what we're going to do seems different. And it's very much perceived as, this is not just Israel, it is also the United States. How accurate is that? How much power does the US actually have to influence Israeli policies right now?
Okay, well, I want to say two things prior to that, and then I'm going to get right to the United States. One is, I'm a Brandeis graduate. I spent—
Yes, you're Brandeis, that's right.
And not only that, but when I was at Brandeis, I was the co-chair of the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, and I used to go to BU to organize BU students at the BU Hello. So I feel right at home talking to you.
That's great.
Now, United States. Every war that Israel has fought from 48 on, 48, 56, 67, 69, 70, the War of Attrition, 73, the Ramadan War, the Yom Kippur War, the Lebanon War in 1982, the Lebanon War in 2006, they all have one thing in common. They don't end until the great powers insist that they end. And after 48, in 48, it was the British who insisted. In 56 and afterwards, it was 56 was the United States and the Soviet Union. And after that, it has always been the United States. So I can predict exactly when this war will end. It will end when the United States turns on the red light. The United States turned on the green light to begin with. When Biden went to Israel, he turned on the yellow light, and that yellow light's getting brighter, but he has not turned on the red light. That is when the war will end. And now, why is that true? The reason it's true is this. Israel has, Zionism and Israel has always known that the creation of a Jewish country in the Middle East against the will of the people who lived in the Middle East was bound to cause huge problems, huge political problems. And nobody really knew how to solve it. And I could spend another lecture in explaining the different Zionist positions on how it might be solved in the long run and what the Iron Wall strategy meant and so on. But the fact is that everybody knew that it was going to be a major political problem. And it has been, and it probably always will be. The point is that it's not a military problem, it's a political problem. So when Israel gets into a war, they can turn the tide and win the military battle. But they tell the country to begin with, this time we are going to let the army get a victory. This time we don't stop till victory. If you watch any of the Israeli government's videos about the army, the soldiers always say, until victory, until victory, until victory. But they will never be able to get a victory because it's a political problem. Therefore, the government has to stop the war before there's a victory. They can't admit that they won't be able to get the victory. So they have to blame it on the United States. They will not stop it until the United States gives them a reason to stop it by telling them, stop. Now, when will the United States do that? That depends on the political judgment of the leadership in the United States as to whether the costs internationally and domestically are heavier to allow the fighting to continue or to stop it. And because the Biden administration will pay heavy costs by turning on the red light. But it's already paying heavy costs now by not turning it on. So that's the role the United States plays. I don't want to go into the whole question of image of the United States here or there right now. Certainly, I agree that after the Cold War, the United States unleashed its power in an utterly destructive way in two uncalled for invasions of the Gulf area. But I think there has been recently in American administrations the understanding that that was a catastrophic error and that we shouldn't be operating in the Middle East that way. Still, American policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict has been paralyzed by the passionate attachment, as George Washington put it, of those in the United States, both evangelicals and those who supported Israel traditionally, many of them Jews, but not all, who see American policy toward Israel as the only question that matters to them, and they are mostly ignorant about what might actually be good, even for the future of the country that they would like. That's another reason why I go back to what you said at the beginning, that ignorance is the biggest of this problem of the actual dynamics, is the biggest obstacle to avoiding super catastrophes and to trading the problems we have for better ones.
I want to ask about the super catastrophe, but I also don't know if I'm ready for that, but we will ask about it. Since you mentioned Brandeis and that you were at BU, oh, and sorry, as a side note, when Professor Lustick was talking about mafia networks and states, if anyone's interested, Charles Tilley has a great piece called War Making and State Making. I can send it to you. But that was just a side note. Universities. I mean, we have taken our time. And partially because we've been watching what's happening on other universities, and we've been terrified to see our own students kind of go at each other or people from outside infiltrating the university and making our students kind of go against each other. As you know, as I've mentioned several times, I'm at Brandeis, just banned SJP. You at Penn, I know that there was a recent Palestine Rights Literature Festival that seemed to have caught the attention of mega donors who wanted it canceled and pulled millions of dollars in planned donations to the university. So I guess this is like a bigger question of what do you see as the responsibility of faculty and students at American universities at this moment in time? What should we be doing?
Well, thanks for that question. I've been involved in this for a long time, and I have advised many universities about how to handle this problem or this question on campus when it's so sensitive. And I come from a very Jewish background, and I have spent a lot of time with Palestinians, and I try to see it through as many different lenses as possible. I've worked in the American government. I've consulted with almost every administration since the 1970s on these issues. And here are the 3 things or 4 things that I say about this. First of all, when you ask what should be allowed on campus, the only rule that a university should use is whether the speaker helps others make good arguments. If someone speaking helps me make a better argument against them or for them, then that speaker is eligible to be invited. And many people might not be interested. They might not be qualified. But as long as they're not insulting me, they're not violent, they're not making simply ad hominem attacks, that is attacking me for who I am, not what I think. Those are arguments, ad hominem arguments, violence, intimidation, insults that cannot help produce better arguments. So they are off limits. One of the biggest problems that we're facing now is not the substantive discussion, substantive differences. I'm teaching a class right now on the making of modern Palestine and Israel, 40 students, and we have absolutely no problem discussing the most sensitive issues because it's fascinating. When I went into this field, I was afraid I would never be able to be successful because there would be so many competitors. Because it was so interesting, everybody would want to study it. In fact, people were terrified to study it because of the emotional baggage. And I found myself one of the only political scientists who spent most of his career studying this particular problem. To me, it's fascinating in all its dimensions. So that's number 1. Number 2 is ad hominem attacks have become the only kind of argument that Israel advocates have been wanting to make. And I say that from an informed point of view. When I used to debate for the Israeli consulate, anti-Zionists. I was a debater against Trotskyites and SDS members back in the 1970s. And I even got a letter of commendation from the San Francisco Israeli consulate. When we used to debate, they would give us a manual. It was written by Benny Neuberger. I still have it. If your opponent talks about the refugees, make these arguments. If they talk about the Suez War, make these arguments. If they talk about this, change the subject. They had all this guidance for what to say for every point and counterpoint. Now, if you look at the manuals that the Israel advocacy organizations distribute for training on campus, they specifically say, I have them, they're online, anybody can see them, do not make substantive arguments. Only attack the bona fides of your opponents. Call them anti-Semites. Find reasons why they should not be considered credible. Why do they do that? Because the policies that Israel has been adopting, especially the current government, are practically not able to be defended by people on American campuses substantively. And this has been a terrible thing for the debate because what it does is it produces ad hominem attacks against anyone who criticizes Israel as anti-Semitic or terrorist, and no ability to engage in the intellectually interesting questions. Okay, what happened in 48? What are the implications of it? Were there opportunities for a compromise? What kind of arrangements for East Jerusalem might be possible? Should East Jerusalem Arabs now apply for Israeli citizenship or vote in municipal elections and not try to end the occupation because it's a one-state reality? There are fascinating questions to talk about. But if you're only trading insults, then you can't address those questions. Two more. Some of the students here will be in screaming matches or yelling matches with people over factual questions. No, that did not happen. Yes, it happened. No, it didn't. There's a simple way out of those ridiculous situations. Just ask if you, and I say this as someone who got into this field, why? Because I cared so much about this. And when I was in college, I would argue with people, and if they knew more than me, I couldn't stand it. So I would immediately go learn. And of course, in learning, I changed my opinions. But that's how I got into this field. I could not stand other people knowing more than I did about this topic. So when I encounter someone who says, no, that's factually wrong, you know, the Arab states, for example, instructed the Arabs of Palestine to leave so that they could come back with a conquering army and wipe the Jews out, which is completely ridiculous. But they believe it. So you say, let me ask you a question. This is what you say. If that were not true, would it matter to you? If somebody is insisting that something is true, which you think is not true, ask them, if that weren't true, would it matter? Now, if the person says, no, it wouldn't matter, I don't care, then you say, well, let's talk about something that matters. Let's not just scream about something that you don't care about. Let's talk about something you care about. If they say, yes, it would matter if I found out that that wasn't true, then you say, let's do research on that. Let's turn it into a scientific, scholarly question. That is how we operate in a university. Turn screaming matches into opportunities for scholarship and research. Now, the other trick I would suggest, the other good trick, I don't mean it as a deceptive move, just as a practice, is always turn things around. When you have an argument in your head, turn it around and see if it works if you didn't know whether you were a Palestinian or an Israeli. So if you say the word kidnapped, somebody is a hostage, they've been taken against their will, does that apply to a man or a woman or a child who's taken in the middle of the night from a house in a refugee camp by by people in uniforms and brought and put into somewhere which the family doesn't know? Well, that's the description of about 1,200 Palestinians who've been abducted from the West Bank and put in prison by Israeli forces without any real charges. So what is a hostage? Those are also hostages because Israel is thinking of trading them against hostages that Hamas and Islamic Jihad has. Wait a minute, how can you think about hostages that way? Well, you see pictures of the horrible picture of the Israeli hostages, pitiful that they've been taken. You could put up pictures of abducted Palestinians and then ask, well, gee, what would I think if a Jewish student tore one of those pictures down? How would I feel? I guess I'd feel the same rage and I'd feel the same hurt as those Jewish students feel when my compadres might tear down the kidnap pictures. That's what I mean. Turn it around and experiment in your mind with that. That takes a lot of self-discipline because it means that you are following a Rawlsian rule. That is, I am using a veil of ignorance to separate my own personal identity from the moral question that's before me. If I'm telling you, I was just today, I'll just share this with you. I've been in a discussion with very old friends of mine. We're all very old now, who've been on the left for a long time. And some of them reacted to the current events in an extreme way. And I just argued to them that it's wrong to infer from the actions of some Palestinians, savage, brutal, disgusting actions against innocent civilians, that all of a sudden you're learning something about what Palestinians are like from what some Palestinians did. And I pointed out, would you say that non-Jews, we're all Jewish, non-Jews should learn something about what all Jews are like because Jewish pilots are killing 130 Palestinian children a day, according to WHO. Should we learn something about what all Jews are like because of that, or because settlers in the West Bank are killed maybe about 160 Palestinian civilians already since the war broke out? No, that's what anti-Semitism is. That's what racism is. You cannot learn about a whole group because of the actions of one, even though emotionally you're so tempted to do that. So again, so those are the suggestions I would make to BU, any university. First, don't draw any lines other than can something help make a good argument? Second, turn screaming matches into opportunities for research and scholarship, and turn things around in your head and play the other side. Look for the parallels so that you can understand where the rage comes from, because it comes from the same place that your rage comes from.
That was brilliant. I have so many more, but we have some amazing students and they're here, also faculty and staff, and so I want you to get to meet them. Can I see a show of hands? Also, people online, we are monitoring the chat. I don't see any Q&A, but please feel free to ask. Anyone wanna? Gideon, come on up.
I thought I wouldn't have to say.
No, I wanted to see you.
Hi. I wanted to ask, so you had talked about sort of a explosion of violence coming out of sort of the conditions of confinement in Gaza. I wanted to ask why it took the specific form it did, because like there are a lot of different directions that someone can take in how to launch, I guess, as you're describing, prison revolts. Like, why is it timed like this? Why did Hamas choose to do this particular tactic of attacking these rural communities, things like that? Like, what went into that?
Okay. Have you ever watched Fauda?
Yes.
Good. I don't watch it anymore, but you know what it means in Arabic. It means chaos. And if you're in if you're actually in a, God forbid, you should be in a war, in violence, it's chaotic. It really is chaotic. It's out of control. So just because something happens doesn't mean that that's, what was planned to happen. Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan till he gets punched in the mouth. And that's true of especially true of violent situations. I think that what you're seeing there is, and it's consistent with what happened to Hamas in 2006. When it ran in elections, it didn't think it was going to win. It ran because it wanted to be the opposition in a legislature that the PA would control. All of a sudden, it won, and it's got to rule Gaza. It never imagined it would be doing that, and it has shown repeatedly that tactically it can succeed, and then it doesn't know what to do with its success. I think that they planned to kidnap people because they're always focused on how many of their own prisoners they can get out. There are 5,200, before this started, there were 5,200 Palestinian prisoners or hostages, whatever you want to call them, in Israeli jails. How are you going to get them out? So, and then they saw, oh my God, it was so easy. I mean, they were able to attack, first they attacked soldiers, they attacked the security force. That's not terrorism. That's just attacking soldiers, and they destroyed the eyes and ears and the lightly staffed battalions along. And then I think opportunism broke out, and pent up rage broke out also. And people came into those settlements who were not part of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. They just poured out of Gaza as looters. And we see this even in the 48 war, Israeli soldiers, or Jewish soldiers, they weren't Israeli yet, in Deir Yassin or anywhere, looting, even raping. It's part of what happens in war. Now, this was an extreme, and I have no doubt that part of it is the pent-up rage that these young men have. Also, usually in these situations, they're hepped up on drugs. When we send our soldiers into fighting in Afghanistan, they're drugged. The Germans drug their soldiers. That's probably true in Ukraine and Russia now. So that's another element to keep in mind. What I'm trying to say is the savagery of it was not necessarily the key element in the planning. That's out of control element, and it's disgusting, and it's worthy of punishment. In fact, I do not consider Hamas as an organization as a legitimate interlocutor anymore about negotiating Palestinian future. The question is whether Israel will become an illegitimate interlocutor about negotiating its future if it becomes associated with war crimes of a too large a scale.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, I just want to say.
Take one more in the room if there's one.
No one in the room.
I'll go with that.
Sure, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I see you can't see me, I suppose, but
I can see you, I can't, yeah, I can see.
Stand up.
Stand up, he'll see you.
I will stand up, all right. Look, when we talk, you say the two-state solution is dead. We may still be sort of lemming-like going back to that on the US side, but were there lost opportunities? When I talk to my friends on the Israeli side of the debate, they often point to the negotiation with Barak in 2000s. They go back to the Olmert. Were there opportunities? And is it really inconceivable to think that we can't somehow revive at least the path to going back that way?
All right, good. This is a very long conversation. I wrote an entire book about it, and I won't try to say the whole thing right now. But the Barak, that's completely wrong, in the sense that there was an opportunity, I think about a 25% chance in the late 90s that Oslo could still lead, despite hundreds of thousands of new settlements and a road network that was breaking the West Bank into an archipelago. Still, it might have happened. Barak and Clinton ruined the possibility. How? By breaking off the process of gradual relinquishment of authority to the PA, of not allowing the PA to have any real authority over land, to protect land from expropriation, and by insisting that there'll be a summit meeting in Washington that Arafat must come to, then promising Arafat that no matter what happens, he won't be blamed for the outcome. Then everyone believed, including me at the time, that the basis of negotiations would be the Balin-Abu Mazen plan of 1995, which was a real two-state solution with a solution to East Jerusalem and the whole shebang. But instead of that, Barak left Balin behind. He did not bring Yossi Sarid or any of the other leading, really effective doves with him. And he wanted to control the whole thing himself. And when he put his proposal on the table, it destroyed the conference immediately, because what it was not only would East Jerusalem not be the capital of Palestine, but Israel would have sovereignty over the Haram al-Sharif, which no one ever imagined would happen. And the West Bank would be cut into 400 pieces because all the roads would be under Israeli sovereignty. So immediately it fell apart, and Clinton sided with Barak. Not a single time was Barak willing to meet personally with Arafat. Not one time was he willing to meet with him. So I can sort of prove that it was Barak's hubris that destroyed this, because when he got home and he was desperate, he was going to lose the election, he didn't know what to do, he allowed an Israeli delegation to go to Taba to negotiate with the PLO, try again, without the Americans there, but with the EU. And at Taba, all of the conditions that Barak had brought to Washington were thrown out the window, and they returned to the Abu Mazen plan. But it was too late. Sharon was already marching on the Temple Mount. The Intifada had already started. Clinton was leading office, and Barak was crushed in the election. So again, I can take any of the little incidents that some of your Israeli interlocutors might have mentioned and show why it's not the way you think. Although the Ehud Olmert, there was something there that had to do, the failure there had to do with the weakness of Olmert and the weakness of Abu Mazen. By that time, the Palestinian Authority had almost no legitimacy left. So he was unable to make any commitment without checking it out. And Ehud Olmert was unwilling to put anything in paper until he got a commitment from Abu Mazen. So it was kind of one of these. And even so, it was I think it was not without promise, but it was a last chance. I do think you're right that the two-state solution idea will return. In fact, it already has. What will happen is when this war ends, and that's when the United States turns on the red light, there will be a reigniting of a peace process. I call it a merry-go-round. I've written a whole article about it called the Peace Process Carousel. It's a carousel never stops. It keeps moving, but it doesn't go anywhere. And all of the peace processes go round and round and then fail. And in the meantime, more settlements get created, more Palestinians feel alienated and feel that the peace process is just a joke anyway, and more pressure on the Palestinians in Gaza. What I believe will happen is that the EU and the United States will gin up a new two-state peace process. There'll be negotiations or how to start the negotiations. There'll be a new government in Israel that will send contradictory signals about whether it's really interested, because the government will have extremists in it as well as moderates. And this will go on for 3 or 4 years. Meanwhile, in Gaza, there will be an interim arrangement. Israel will have control of security apparatus, and the international community, Egypt, the Gulf, will be responsible for feeding the inmates. I mean, taking care of the Gazans and developing. And that interim arrangement will last beyond the failure of the peace process. But there'll be arguments about it. Israel will claim that that security threats are being smuggled in by those humanitarian aid workers or the economic development, and therefore refuses to allow a port to be built or an airport to be opened. And the international community says Israel is exaggerating the security threats and it's not allowing them proper opportunities to develop the Gaza Strip. Those arguments will continue for several years. And I and Lustick will write an article saying what's happening here is that Israel is trying to privatize the prison services. It wants to be the warden, but have somebody else operate the cafeteria. And that's not going to work. Ultimately, you're going to have another prison revolt until the prison closes. And it can close in 2 ways. And I'll just say what those 2 are to leave room for other questions. One is that Israel actually Gaza secedes from Israel. If I say it's a one state already, there doesn't mean that can't separate. It means that if it does, you call it a secession. You don't call it a negotiated withdrawal. It's a secession. It's a state contraction, like Russia, like West Pakistan pushed out East Pakistan and made it Bangladesh. It became Bangladesh. That can happen in Gaza if Israel says, okay, we're actually not going to have security responsibility for the Gaza Strip. It's going to be a UN trusteeship. Find somebody who wants to take that trusteeship. That would be one way. Another way would be to say it's part of the country, to take down, to integrate Gaza and the Gaza Palestinians into Israel, just as the West Bank is being integrated, but allow Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank free movement. Now, that means recognize it to start democratizing the state of Israel, allow those very underpopulated areas in the Northwest Negev to be repopulated by the hundreds of thousands of people who used to live there anyway. Mm-hmm. Now, interestingly, and this is my last point, is that the Trump plan, which is laughable in most respects, in almost all respects, but not in one respect, unlike any other plan since the 1950s, the Trump plan actually envisaged substantial areas of the Northwest Negev, although pretty desolate areas, to be places where Gaza refugees would move to. And those areas are inside the Green Line. So that's the only plan I have seen in 70 years that actually imagines Palestinian refugees moving back into Israel. It's the Trump plan.
Interesting, surprising. I see there's more. I know that we have some more in the room, but there's also one online that I want to post to you. So one of our guests says there's a lot of different vocabulary coming up regarding how to view Israel-Palestine, i.e. genocide, apartheid, occupation, conflict. Does it matter which label we choose to use? Are there certain labels that you believe to be incorrect? How is that language politicized?
Wow, great question. There are 2 parts of this question, let's say. One is the genocide question and one is the settler colonialism question. I'm sure the students are aware. I will not use the word genocide in the context of Israel's pulverization of the Gaza Strip or the mass killing that is going on. I have worked on contract with the Holocaust Museum in the United States, which is dedicated in part to identifying the circumstances which point to the possibility of genocide or mass atrocities. Mass killing itself is not genocide, but it can lead to that. It's the kind of thing you watch for. When I don't want to use the word genocide unless I mean a plan for the elimination of a particular people. And I don't believe that there's a plan for that that's being put into operation. Not that there aren't people in Israel who aren't thinking that way, but I do not want to say that mass killing itself, as horrible as that is genocide. And by the way, well, not by the way, I want to start getting into what is mass killing on a, what have been there's certain, if you look at all the wars that Israel has fought in Gaza, and even over all the wars, there's a certain ratio between Israeli deaths and Arab deaths. And there's a standard ratio, which is about 10 to 1. And below that 10 to 1, Israel feels that it's been defeated ultimately. In Gaza, it's 20 to 1. So if you start thinking about what mass killing is in the context of Gaza wars over the last 15 years, you'd have to multiply by 20 the number of Israelis killed to get to the size of the number that I immediately expect will be killed. So anything below that is sort of represents an American move that's earlier than it has been in the past. I know that's horrible, but if you are actually looking at how wars are fought, that's what you come up with. Now, that's the genocide. I would not call it genocide. I don't need that word to express my abhorrence of what it is. But the settler colonialism is a trickier, more interesting question, because settler colonialism is a valid way and an accurate way to think about Israel. In fact, the founders of Israel, from Jabotinsky to Ben Gurion, thought of themselves as settler colonists. That's how they thought of themselves. And they looked at Weber and others who discussed how settlement was to be used in colonization in order to figure out what to do. In his writings, Jabotinsky was very frank. We are settler colonists, and the indigenous populations won't like us any more than the Sioux like the white settlers in the United States. Of course, that's the way things work. It's the way they always work. The Palestinian Arabs are just as committed to their land as any other people that we colonialists from Europe, we alien settlers, he referred to the Jews as, have encountered. But just saying something is settler colonialism doesn't tell you nearly enough to understand what's going on, because there's so many versions of settler colonialism. The big difference that comes to your mind when you look at Israel is this. Israel came into existence at the tail end of colonialism, when there wasn't much power left in Europe to sustain it. So, and for that reason and for other reasons, Israel did not eliminate the Aboriginal population. It expelled hundreds of thousands, but it didn't kill them all. It didn't annihilate them. It didn't make them demographically and politically irrelevant, as was done to the Indians in the United States, or was done in Canada, or was done in Australia. So that leaves Israel with a different kind of problem than most settler colonial states have, which is the colonized are all around them in big numbers. And this makes a political problem that most settler colonies don't have. In fact, if you look at South Africa, you look at Algeria, you look at the United States, the only settler colony that still exists that did not eliminate its Aboriginal population is Israel. I mean, South Africa is an example, but it changed. It changed its regime. So that's a distinctive element. Another element, and this is a little more controversial, is there's too much rhetoric as opposed to theory and insight associated with settler colonialism, because people don't like the word colonial or settler, although it used to be a good word in Zionism, but it's a bad word now in general rhetoric. And so people talk about the need to decolonize, but they never say what they mean by decolonize. Like, what would it mean to decolonize something? Where has there ever been a successful case of decolonization? Show me. Where? Because if that's what you want, I want to know what it looks like. There are real tough questions to be asked about that whole body of literature. I also am fascinated by this. When imperialists visit a country, whether it's in West Africa, they go up to West Africa, they find tribes there. And they say, oh, these tribes have always been here. We will work with the local rulers. They're the indigenous rulers. Well, those indigenous rulers happen to be the indigenous rulers at that time, but that's because they defeated and wiped out the previous tribes just about 20 years earlier. So whoever seems to be in charge when the Europeans come, they appear to be the natives. So when we look back at the Navajo or the Lakota or any of the large American tribes, they are where they were because they defeated and dispossessed and settled and colonized the areas of other tribes. So it's like, it's not that it's bad things don't happen when in settler colonialism, very bad things happen, but it's not like it hasn't been happening for all of human history. That's mostly how civilizations move, change, and get established. And that's not to excuse them, it's just to give an account.
I know we're running almost at time, but I'm going to take one more question from here. And Nisha, do you want to come up?
Hi, Professor. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for your valuable insight. Secondly, I'm not quite knowledgeable on the issue, so I apologize if my question sort of maybe phrased incorrectly. But were there attempts by other Arab nations to sort of intervene and propose a two-state solution? And if so, what went wrong in the process?
Well, yes. I mean, as I said, Jordan issued a certain kind of opportunity first for a Hashemite kingdom, and then in the mid-'80s, negotiating with Shimon Peres the possibility of a deal that would involve some sort of a Palestinian entity. Egypt really wanted to do that as part of the Camp David Accords, but Carter could not get Menachem Begin to entertain anything like that idea, and he faced rabid political opposition at home. Edward Kennedy was running against him in the primaries, and he was told he would lose the nomination to Kennedy if he continued to press for a Palestinian homeland as part of his negotiations between Israel and Egypt. So he stopped. That was in the midst of a massive public relations campaign that Moshe Dayan triggered when he came here and told Vance and Carter that Israel would not agree to go down the road toward a two-state, or something like a two-state solution. But so Egypt said, okay, we can't get that, we'll take a separate peace. Also, the Saudi peace plan. This is an Arab peace plan that the Saudis developed more than 20 years ago and put on the table that said if Israel gets out of all the territories it captured, a Palestinian state is established with East Jerusalem as its capital, all of us Arab states will recognize Israel and live in peace. Israel hasn't yet to respond officially to that initiative. It is still on the table. It has never been responded to. Of course, no Israeli government can imagine having the political ability to withdraw from the territories, certainly from the West Bank or East Jerusalem. But the fact is that if you ask whether Arab states have taken a stand on this, absolutely. They have been pushing for this for quite some time, although they haven't been willing to pay high costs for it.
Yeah, so maybe on if you can give us 2 minutes, how to avoid the super catastrophe,
Oh.
And
what I mean by that, yeah.
Yeah, and you can say about anger and vengeance, and if those two are combined, I assume they might be combined. Maybe not.
I won't combine them, but I'll say something quick about the second, and then tell you what I mean by super catastrophe. When you feel rage, and when you feel or you see someone who feels that they would get satisfaction out of the suffering of someone on the other side because of how much suffering has been caused by somebody on the other side to somebody on my side, when you see that, try to feel share it, try to see how it feels and why somebody could feel that way about what you or people on your side were doing. Now, that is crucial. If you want to put yourself in the position of Gaza young men who find themselves with arms in an Israeli settlement that is so well appointed while their children are starving, and they have never seen anything like this, and these are on their lands, and they feel the way inmates of a Jewish ghetto, lahavdil, would feel if they suddenly had an opportunity to be in a Nazi encampment. Not that Israelis at all are Nazis, but that the rage and feeling of deprivation and fury and feeling of license and desire for vengeance is something that's human. And you can, oh yeah, I can see how I could feel that way. And then imagine that is how Gazans feel. It doesn't excuse them for their behavior that's savage, but you can understand where it comes from without dehumanizing them, because you can see it in yourself. On the super catastrophe, Hamas has been, and Islamic Jihad have been sending thousands of rockets toward Israel. These are largely unguided, primitive. They don't do very much damage. Once in a while, they might hit a building. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, thanks to Iran, and thanks to Hezbollah's own skills and training and years of preparation, have 100,000 missiles, not rockets. Very accurate, very powerful. The reason there hasn't been a war in Lebanon since 2006 is because Israel has actually been deterred from attacking, because they're afraid of those missiles. They're afraid of Israeli cities being destroyed by, even if Lebanon would be destroyed, but they're afraid of having Haifa destroyed. That's Israel deterred. There are those in Israel. In fact, Michael Oren, the ex-ambassador in the United States, was on CNN arguing about 2 weeks ago that Israel should not enter Gaza now. The Israelis should let Hamas stew in its own juices. We should attack Lebanon, which is the real problem. Now that the world is supporting us, we should attack the terrorists in Lebanon and knock out the Hezbollah forces. That would mean putting all Israelis underground for 2 or 3 days while we destroy the Lebanon sites and take all the missiles that they're going to send us. That's the catastrophe. That's the super catastrophe I want to avoid. I think Biden going to Israel helped a lot to prevent that super catastrophe. It's still possible, but by going to Israel, for all the clumsy mistakes he made, he also anchored Israeli policy, because Israel knew that once Biden was there, anything Israel did would be seen by the world as having been authorized by Biden. So it puts a tremendous burden of responsibility on Israeli decision makers to know that they will rightfully be punished by the United States for implicating it in something that the United States utterly opposes, like attacking Iran or attacking Lebanon.
On that note, thank you so much. Join me in thanking you.
You're welcome.
Online or in person that we didn't get to. Online, I've saved all your questions. In person, this is one of 4 events, and so please come back and we can ask them.
I want to say one thing. If people were disturbed, in pain by anything that I said, confused, you can write me, and I will try to respond to you. ilustick@sas.upenn.edu, but it's very easy to find my email address, and even easier to find my writings so that you can criticize them in detail.
Thank you. That's very, very generous.